For a lot of my friends who are locking into YouTube and finding these messages and thought packages from me, I guess some of you have been a bit surprised at my appearance, and if you haven't been in touch with my kind of journey in recent days, you may not know that the reason for my loss of those 1960s, 70s long locks and beard and all that stuff. What was called by Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young in their Deja Vu album, their freak flag. I'm going to keep my freak flag flying. They sang in a song that said, "Almost cut my hair last night, but I didn't and I won't." And I think it said, "It increases my paranoia." Well, unfortunately, I've been battling cancer for 15 years. I've not made a lot of noise about it. I've not sought the kind of sympathy and so on, but it's reached a stage where after 15 years out of battle, I had to take chemical treatment, chemo as they call it. And the result of that is that the beard and the mustache and the hair all started to fall out. So for some of you, you may be confused as to whether it's really the biker John Smith from God Squad, the kind of unorthodox preacher and so on. Well, it is me. And during these days of treatment, I'm determined to keep on being useful, hopefully. And so with a couple of friends, I'm working on doing these kinds of series of reflections on many, many issues of life. I want to take up some controversial subjects along the way, but I thought today what I might just talk about for a few minutes is some reflection that's come out of struggling with the whole issue of cancer. There are many, many issues about prostate cancer that don't come out in public, which maybe on another occasion I might talk about. The journey is not an easy one. And sometimes you feel with prostate cancer the attitude is, oh, well, sooner or later, if you live long enough, you'll end up getting it anyway. So you get kind of very strange responses, often from your mates. And of course, the effect on your sexuality and all of that stuff opens up the kind of thing that blokes, to use an Aussie term, fellas or whatever if you're American, chaps if you're England, I don't know, but whatever you call the male species, it creates some real problems in conversation. If you share something of the struggle you have when surgery and radiation and the removal of your testosterone through chemical treatment really impacts on your love life. If in somebody's case they're fortunate like me to have a very affectionate wife with a long history of our enjoying intimacy together, then the effect of all this is pretty devastating. And when you tend to share it with your mates, you tend to get sort of offhanded, ha-ha type jokes. And your own mates don't realise sometimes how devastating the whole journey is. So I may in the future spend some time talking about that journey, which could be useful since this is one of the major killers for you men out there. And I think that we're not really told in the public forum the kind of journey it is and the way in which the medical profession treats you and so on. I've had some wonderful, wonderful support from oncologists and others, but I also see some very painful parts of the journey that I think the medical profession could certainly improve on in dealing with us as blokes as we go through that journey. But the thing I just wanted to talk about for a few minutes today is a lesson, a strange lesson that came to me in reflecting upon what these cancer cells are and what they're doing to me. Now, the irony is, as I understand it, if you're a medico, send me an email or something and correct me if I've got this wrong. But as I understand it, that cell, which we call a cancer cell, is unlike most of the other cells in our body in that it doesn't have a used by date on it. Now, we all know that the cells on our hands and for much of our body anyway, in a sense, self-destruct and are replaced by another generation year after year after year. And of course, there's the whole aging process and so on. But fundamentally, the cancer cell keeps on reproducing and not dying. And I always think it looks almost like it's playing God, that it's the kind of, I'm not going to die, I'm the eternal cell. And of course, the irony is that it grows exponentially. And the more it grows, the more it grows. And in the end, of course, unless the good Lord is to do a miracle, which I believe in, and I've been prayed for many times, sometimes by people with gifts in the healing area, and I have faith about the possibility of that. I've been through healing in the past, so I'm not cynical about that. But at this point, it's not happened for me. And I've had everybody from healing preachers to you too lay hands on me and pray for me over the years. So if that doesn't happen, if I'm not healed by a miracle, then it's inevitable really that these cells will take me out and take me to a better place. But I just wanted to say, this has opened up to me a whole discussion about growth. You know, we all know that if a little child doesn't grow, then that's a real tragedy. If we end up with dwarfism or something like that, that's a tragedy. But it's also true that there are some rare diseases that cause a person to grow too fast and grow too much, and that's deadly as well. And in this case, these hidden cells inside the body are growing at a massive rate, and all sorts of savage treatments to slow down their growth are required to survive. So I started asking myself, what about the theory of growth? I mean, in my country, there's been huge debate about whether the economy is going to grow enough. And if we can't have a political party that causes substantial growth to occur in our economy, then we don't see them as worthy to lead us. And so the question of whether growth is the most important thing, or whether using the resources we have to meet the needs of the community, particularly the part of the community that is disadvantaged and poor or marginalised, whether that's the more important issue than having a surplus, as we would call it economically, is a huge debate in our Western capitalist countries. But we're all on about growth. We're fanatical about growth more than we are about health. Sorry for that. And I thought to myself, for those that are into what we call church growth, the same question must be asked. The question is not how great is the rate of growth. The question is, what is it that we are growing? And that's caused me a lot of grief, because actually this is a time in history when the church is probably growing at a rate never seen before, or rarely seen before in human history. Most people kind of think that Islam is the fastest growing religion. As I understand it, that's not true. In actual fact, the Christian faith is the fastest growing religion in the world at present. And of course, some of the missiologists and number crunchers have actually said that they believe that even in China, that there may be as many as 100 million Christians. The missionaries left, we all thought the church would collapse, and in fact it went underground and has thrived and is a massive movement even within China. In Latin America, in some parts of Asia, what we would call the church appears to be growing very, very fast. But I have a problem. I watch sometimes the television, I watch YouTube and see some of the preachers that actually, strangely enough, it's difficult when your name's John Smith, because I'm quite sure there are some preachers out there saying stuff that this John Smith doesn't want to have his name attached to at all. But I struggle because I see so often preachers, people claiming to be faith healers, who preach stuff that's quite contrary to what the Gospels show us Jesus said. Now, there are a number of issues we could take up, and it would take us hours to go through them all. But to give you just one, Jesus said, beware of covetousness, of the hunger for stuff, if you want to put it in normal language. Beware of covetousness, which is the sin of idolatry. Now, given that Jesus was a Jew, and he was speaking to a Jewish audience at the time, this makes it even more powerful, because the 10 Commandments, the very core from the Torah for the Jewish faith, begin with the fact that there is one God, and that God only you must serve. It goes on to say that we are to love God, and of course Jesus on a couple of occasions repeated the fact that the greatest commandment is to love God with all your heart, and the second one is your neighbour as yourself. And in the story of the rich young ruler, Jesus challenges this young successful dude who's a good man. I mean, it says in one of the passages Jesus loved him. He was a person that was attractive as a bloke, and Jesus saw him as a good man. And he said, well, what do the commandments say? And he went through all the commandments. And in the end, he said, I've kept all these commandments from when I was a little kid. In other words, I really have sought to be a good bloke. I haven't pinched my neighbour's stuff. I haven't lived an ungodly, wicked life. But Jesus said to him, there's one thing you lack. Sell everything you've got, give it to the poor, and come follow me. Now, my difficulty is this. If Jesus was in many of the mega churches today, the advice of the pastor would be to work hard and do well, and to be generous and to give 1/10 to the church, or maybe a bit more than that, and to do some good stuff. But at the same time, they certainly would not usually say, sell all you've got, give it all to the poor and come follow me. As I watch much of the church today and see the growth of churches based on telling people that if they have faith, they will become rich, I ask myself, is this spiritual cancer cells rather than the real deal? Now, I was out on the edge of the desert just last year with some Aboriginal folk, and there was a white preacher came to this old tin shed, which was packed out mostly with Indigenous people. It was a painful scene, because a group of us had been out in the desert, and we'd been at a kind of, I don't know what you'd call it, a convention out in the bush, really living out in the most beautiful outback of Australia. And we'd come back in this night, and some of the group was supposed to lead in the worship music, and some were supposed to preach and share. Well, it turned out that this particular white preacher took over the whole thing, and the Aboriginal guy, who was actually very smart and a very good speaker, who we understood was supposed to preach, was really pushed aside and didn't get to do it. The painful thing for me in that service was that this preacher got one of the Aboriginal women to read a biblical passage before the offering was taken up, the money was collected. Now you've got to understand, this is a shed full of dirt poor Aboriginal people. These are people living on welfare handouts, and not very generous ones at that. Not only that, when we're out in the desert, we listened to some of the doctors who were working with these Aboriginal people, and one of these doctors described to us how the alcohol effect on a lot of the guys was such that the women would often, of course, be beaten up when one of these guys was drunk. And what he told us was that many of the women you would see with their arms in a sling were actually in that state because they would put up their arm to protect themselves when the domestic scene got violent, and they were suffering from broken arms. And one of the major intakes into the hospital where he served was women with broken arms trying to protect themselves. So I'm sitting here in this church surrounded by dirt poor Aboriginal people. Strangely enough, amongst many of the people out there near Alice Springs, there is a real love for Jesus. And despite all the sad stories about what has happened at mission centres, overall there's been a real acceptance of Jesus by many of these folk. But sitting in the congregation are a number of these women with arms in slings. And so we're sitting there, and those of us that knew this, that weren't just tourists dropping in, there's a certain pain in our hearts. Anyway, this particular preacher got this Aboriginal woman to get up and read a very famous passage from St. Paul, when St. Paul wrote to young Timothy, who he'd appointed as the pastor of an early Christian church in the city of Ephesus. In this passage, St. Paul warned Timothy about money and the love of it being the root of all kinds of evil. And it's a very strong anti-materialistic passage. But what the preacher had done was that between the different lines of that particular passage, he had written his little bits that had actually virtually contradicted everything that St. Paul was saying. And at the end of this, the final thing he'd written for her to say said that if they were generous in their offering, which of course in this case, as I understand, was going to go to the white preacher, if they were generous in their offering, that when they went to the bank on Monday, they would find that God had put a heap extra money in their bank accounts. Now, my dear friends, I don't believe that's true. I don't believe that they would have found that to be true. But these were people with an almost childlike trust in the preachers that come to speak to them. And this is the kind of church building that's called church growth by those kind of preachers. I could go for a long time. Perhaps one little story. I was watching a well-known American healer preacher, and he actually said with great cynicism, you know, there are many preachers who who don't believe our prosperity doctrine. And some of them even say, give and expect nothing in return. And he sneered as he gave that quote. And then he said, I have a song for them. How dumb thou art, how dumb thou art. The only problem is that those words, give and expect nothing in return, happen to be the words of Jesus from the Gospels. Now, I am bamboozled, I don't know what other word to use, that Christians can hear that kind of preaching. And they are so ignorant about what Jesus taught that they don't react. Now, this is painful for me. I don't want to criticize my fellow preachers, and I don't want to be against church growth. But I have to ask, if you build churches on distortion and on contradiction of what Jesus taught, what are you growing? What is the cellular growth? Is that church growth, or is it the growth of heresy? Now, what I do know is that God's love is such that, quite frankly, all of us as preachers come short of being right about everything, no question. You'll pick stuff I'll go wrong on too. We all make mistakes in our interpreting the biblical text. But some of this stuff is so outlandish and so contrary to the text. And I'm concerned because St. Paul said to the Ephesian church, actually, when he was leaving to go on a journey from which he would never return to see them again, he said to them, as he was amongst their elders and leaders and about to leave, he said to them, look after yourselves and the church for whom Christ shed his blood. Now, you don't shed your blood for something that doesn't matter. So church is important. Even though today we have a lot of people saying, I love Jesus, but I hate the church. Well, they got a problem, because the old book says that he actually shed his blood for the church. But therefore, the kind of church I'm going to build, the kind of church I'm going to foster, the kind of church growth I'm going to believe in, surely has to be one that's consistent with the teachings and lifestyle and example of Jesus. If it isn't, then I think we have a cancer rather than real healthy growth. Now, there's lots of other issues. There are issues like inclusivism, the fact that in the Bible, Jesus is a friend of publicans, sinners, and outcasts. And I might note there that, of course, some of those outcasts are not poor. They may be rich but still be social outcasts and pariahs, like tax collectors. And maybe some of the prostitutes might have been doing well too. But the fact is that nevertheless he was a friend of the wrong end of town. Now, when I was young, the church didn't welcome those kind of people. Nowadays, in my 50-odd years of ministering, next year will be, I think, the 50th year that I've been a pastor or a preacher of some sort. In all those years, what I have noticed is a tremendous change, because when I first started preaching and grew my hair long and liked listening to Bob Dylan and the Grateful Dead and all that stuff, I got into so much strife back then because I was breaking rank with the way most people saw stuff in terms of culture. And it wasn't easy in those early days. In those days, the kind of people I'm talking about were not really easily welcomed into what we call the state church. Nowadays, orphanages in the third world, stopping the abuse of girls in child prostitution, all those things are now mega. And thank God the church is really at the forefront of taking a stand on those issues. And that's fantastic. Thank God for that. And I'm glad the church is doing that. But now we have another problem, because whereas the church seemed to be exclusive when I was young, it's now become so inclusive that it's forgotten that while Jesus was a friend of even people like Zacchaeus, the tax collector, who would have been a money-grubbing, super rich dude, but Jesus invited himself to his home, and a transformation occurred in Zacchaeus' life according to the Bible record. But for all of that, the fascinating thing is Jesus said, beware of covetousness, which is the sin of idolatry. And yet Matthew, who's a tax collector, becomes one of his disciples, writes one of his Gospels, and actually, if the story is true, as I believe it is, when Matthew gets called to be a disciple, he throws a party, and all his mates, who are the outcasts, all turn up to the party. So while Jesus is inclusive socially and in relationship, still his words are exclusive in terms of behavior that is inappropriate. So he says, beware of covetousness, which is the sin of idolatry, the worst of all sins, because it is replacing God with stuff and the obsession of having stuff. So, on the other hand, we find Jesus is a friend of prostitutes. We find that the woman that had been caught in adultery is about to be stoned by the self-righteous males. It's interesting to ask where the bloke was and why they weren't stoning him. But in that kind of patriarchal culture, that's the way it went. But Jesus rescues her. But he says to her, I don't condemn you either. I haven't come to condemn you, but go and sin no more. Now, this is the fascinating thing, that the ethics of Jesus are actually tougher than the ethics of the Pharisees. For instance, with the Pharisees, when it comes to getting with somebody else's wife, just make sure you're not the woman that gets caught, and whatever you do, don't get caught. But Jesus says, if you look on a woman like this, you've already committed the sin of adultery. So Jesus' ethical standards are not lighter, they're tougher. And what I find a problem for the church now is that we've accepted now the inclusiveness of Jesus, but we've lost the exclusiveness of the godliness, of the goodness, of the honesty, of the integrity, of the character, of the holiness, which the gospel is meant to bring to our lives. So, I guess to end this off, I just want to say that reflecting on the cancer cells that appear to somehow have no use-by date on them, and they're the most dangerous cells in my body, that unless the Lord steps in to heal them, it'll be what eventually takes me out. It's not just a question of growth. It's a question of what are you growing. It's not how fast you're growing. It's is your growth healthy. It's not is your church adding numbers. It's is your church reflecting Jesus and what he taught as the one who died and shed his blood for the church, that it might be, as other passages of Scripture say, like a pure bride, like somebody that is morally and ethically walking in the goodness and integrity of Jesus himself.